how do you actually know if you can retire? We all know that simply planning for an arbitrary portfolio value is the wrong approach, but we don't necessarily know what the right approach is. That's why in today's video, I'm gonna share with you 3 steps every retiree should take before retiring so they can not only know that they can retire, but that they can stay comfortably retired regardless of what happens in the market. Now to illustrate this, I'm not just gonna tell you 3 conceptual things, I'm gonna walk you through an actual client case study. We're gonna call these clients John and Jane Sample. And John and Jane Sample came to us wanting to know, can we retire? They had done a good job of saving. They had money in their portfolio, they had Social Security benefits, but there's not this magic thing that says you can now retire. So they came to us for that guidance. And they wanted to know, what do we want to look at to ensure that not only can we retire, but we're not gonna have to go back to work one day. We're not gonna have to sacrifice lifestyle one day because we weren't fully prepared to be able to do this. So what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna look at their financial plan. And when we look at their financial plan, I like to think of this as like the rough draft. John and Jane, tell me what you want retirement to look like. Tell me about your assets. Tell me about your income. Let's put that into a plan as the rough draft. It's not the final version, but the rough draft is very telling because it starts to point out opportunities, it starts to point out risks, and most importantly, it starts to show us where do we stand today in relation to those retirement goals. So let's jump right in. And as I said, this is a rough draft. This wasn't their final plan, but this is what we started with to start to see when could they retire. So here's John and Jane Sample. They're 60 years old. John has his 401k of $920,000. Jane has her IRA of $310,000 and her Roth IRA of $20,000. They've got some savings. They're not going to live on this. This is just like their emergency fund, but they do have a joint investment account, and then they have a home and a mortgage that's almost paid off. Now, when John and Jane came to us, they were getting ready to retire. In fact, they wanted to be done today, but the feedback they wanted from us was, is that possible? And if not, how much longer do we need to work to make it possible? So we said, let's show you that. And how we're gonna show you that is we're gonna assume that your goal is to retire today. So let's illustrate what would your plan look like if you retire today, not because that's what's going to happen with certainty, but just to illustrate what would that look like? And then we could test that against what if you work 1 more year, 2 more years, 5 more years, start to show you how that impacts what the outcome would look like. So in addition to just wanting to know when do they want to retire, which we're assuming is today, we need to have an understanding of what do you want to spend in retirement. And what you want to spend in retirement is a reflection of what you want lifestyle to look like. What do we want to be able to maintain in terms of your ability to live comfortably, to travel, to do the things that you want to do? We went through an exercise and they thought that $5,500 per month would cover their basics. That's food, that's utilities, that's entertainment, that's other things like that that they're going to have for the duration of their retirement. On top of that, we need to understand what's healthcare going to cost. So they're retiring at 60, at least in this projection, they're going to need to come up with their own healthcare coverage for the first 5 years. And what we assumed, or what we looked into, is it would cost about $800 per month for the plan that they would both enroll in. So $9,600 per year, $800 per month, is what they'd be paying pre-Medicare for health insurance. And then after Medicare, they would have their Medicare Part B and Part D premiums. And we're assuming another $4,000 per year of out-of-pocket costs. Next, we said there's going to be new cars every so often. And if each of you maybe drives cars for 10 years, let's plan for $25,000 every 5 years. So John gets a new car, then Jane gets a car 5 years later, John 5 years later, and that just continues to rotate. Maybe not forever, but for the first 15 years or so in retirement. Then on top of that, they wanted to travel. They said the $5,500 per month that we're looking at here, that covers our basics. We're gonna live comfortably, but it doesn't allow us to take the trips that we want to take. So in determining and walking through some of the travel that they wanted to do, they thought about $20,000 per year would fully cover that. The next question though that I asked them is, how long are you traveling? Are you traveling the same way at age 85 that you are at age 65? And they said, no, probably not. We've got some trips that we want to take. Let's plan for this travel for the first 12 years. From age 60 to 72 is what we're illustrating in here. So these are the goals that they had. Next, we're looking at their income sources. So they both have a salary. John's at 135, Jane's at 90. But remember, we're assuming they're retiring today. So while we're planning on these, we're showing work discontinuing immediately. So they won't actually receive any more of this. John has his Social Security benefit, and we walked through when he might take it, and he thought at age 70 he'd take it, and we're going to start with that. His full retirement age benefit is $3,822, which means if he waits until age 70, The system's actually going to show that going up by 8% per year from 67 to 70 because he's collecting what are called delayed retirement credits. Jane, on the other hand, we were thinking probably be best for her to collect at age 67. Her benefit at full retirement age is $2,300. So these are the income sources they have. And so what we've done so far is we said, John and Jane, what are your goals? When you want to retire, how much you want to spend, what you want to do. We know what John and Jane's assets are in terms of IRAs, 401ks, other investments, and we know what their income sources are. We're seeing those right here. The next thing we want to do is put this all together. What does our cash flow look like throughout retirement? And then from there, we'll be able to run the 3 stress tests that every retiree should run before actually making the decision to retire. So this is what their cash flow page looked like every single time. So if you've been watching these videos, you'll know this is the order that we go through. We want to start with cash flow. Cash flow is the lifeblood of your ability to retire. What income do you have coming in, and is it sufficient to meet the expenses you're going to have going out? Well, if we break it down, these columns here show income. These columns here show expenses. So to start, you see there's nothing in income. Their salary goes away because we're assuming they retire now. Of course, they haven't actually retired yet, but what we're doing is illustrating the impact of retiring now before they make the decision to do so. If they retire now, there's 0 income coming in for several years because Social Security doesn't kick in for Jane for 7 more years and for John for 10 more years. So we can start to see what their total Social Security benefit will look like 7 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and that's what we're projecting out right here. So those are their income flows. What we're comparing that to is what will their expenses be. So we're separating expenses out into a few different categories. These core expenses here, number 1 is just living expenses. This is the $5,500 per month we went through. Groceries, utilities, gym memberships, cable, all those things are included in this $5,500 per month, and we're going to increase this by inflation. So $5,500 per month is $66,000 per year, and you can see that number increasing to ensure that as inflation goes up, their purchasing power goes up with it, or their purchasing power is maintained with it. The next expense is housing, and you can see here housing looks different. It doesn't simply go up with inflation. That's by design. If we look at their housing costs, we see that their mortgage is going to be paid off in about 3.5 years. So they'll carry that mortgage into retirement. Once the mortgage is paid off, they'll still have property taxes, but their total housing cost will go down dramatically after 3 years and go down even more by year 4. So we're planning for that expense for a little bit, but then that expense goes away. The next thing we're looking at is healthcare. So what does healthcare look like before Medicare age? What does it look like after Medicare age? So we're projecting that for them as well. So here's those total kind of core expenses between their basic living expenses, housing, and healthcare. But on top of that, they have their goals. And their goals are travel for every year for the first 12 years, $20,000. You'll see we're keeping that up with inflation. And then that stops at age 72. Then they have cars every 5 years, and you'll see that we're planning for that as well. So we look at core expenses plus goals, so the additional expenses, and then we're projecting estimated taxes they would need to pay on top of that, and that's in this column right here. When we add all of this up, we get total outflows. Total outflows is the amount that they need so they can pay taxes, pay for travel, pay for healthcare, pay for housing, and then have $5,500 left over each month to ensure they can still pay the bills and live comfortably. Here's where we want to go with this. We see here's their total outflows. We want to compare that to their total income. Well, total income is 0. Social Security hasn't started yet. So the first year of retirement, they need to take out $142,000 from their portfolio to be able to pay for all those expenses. Then what we can start to do is see year by year, how does that change? Some years it spikes, like in this year right here. Well, this is a year they're buying a car. Assuming all that comes from their portfolio, the amount they need to take out increases. But what starts to happen is you actually see these numbers go down a little bit after a little while. They're going down because the mortgage gets paid off after 4 years. So there's no more mortgage payment. Still property taxes, but no mortgage payment. It goes down a little bit again in this area. So Social Security kicks in. Once Jane turns 67, less needs to come from their portfolio because more is now coming from Social Security so they can maintain the same income level with less actually coming from their portfolio. Fast forward a little bit further, and John's Social Security benefit comes in. And because he has a strong benefit and you waited until 70 to collect it, it's a pretty substantial income stream. So when that pretty substantial income stream comes in, it significantly lessens how much needs to come from the portfolio. So why do I go through this? I thought we were talking about stress testing your portfolio. What does this actually tell us? Well, what this actually tells us is how much we need from our portfolio, which allows us to back into the first test everyone needs to run before they retire, which is the withdrawal rate test. Is the amount that you're withdrawing from your portfolio sustainable when you look at that as a withdrawal rate? So don't just look at it as a dollar value. Look at that of how does that compare to my portfolio value? In John and Jane's case, their portfolio value is about $1.5 million. So let's take a look. Here's what that looks like. What this page shows us, this is the first part of your test to see can you retire, is what is your withdrawal rate? Not just year one, but all the way through retirement. Well, if they're taking $140,000 out of their portfolio in year one of retirement, and they've got about $1.5 million in their portfolio, that represents a withdrawal rate of about 8.8%. Now here's the thing. If you've done any reading or watched any videos or have any understanding of how retirement withdrawals work, you know that that's that's certainly way too high of a withdrawal to sustain forever. If you take out 8.8% of your portfolio value, year in and year out, there's a very good chance you're gonna run out of money before you run out of life. So as we look at this, the temptation is to say, okay, your starting portfolio withdrawal is too high, therefore John and Jane, you can't retire. That's not necessarily the case though. That's why we don't just want to look at year one of retirement, we want to look at all the years of retirement, and that's why we run these projections. We can see those withdrawal rates start much higher. But what then happens? Why do these withdrawal rates start to drop pretty significantly? Well, two reasons. Number one, expenses start to go down. The mortgage is paid off. They stop traveling as much 12 years into retirement. But number two, and more importantly, income starts to increase in the future. Jane's Social Security starts at age 67, and that lessens the portfolio withdrawal. John's Social Security benefit starts at age 70, and that lessens the portfolio withdrawal even more. To the point that when we look later on in their retirement, once there's no more travel or not as much travel, and they have full Social Security, their withdrawals are around 1.8 to 1.9%. They bump up at age 75, but that's more because they're forced to take those distributions. If they wanted to, they could just turn around and reinvest them in their taxable account. Those are required minimum distributions. But as we look at this, it can be a little confusing. Let's assume 4% is a sustainable withdrawal rate. Well, do we look at these early withdrawals of 8 to 10%, which are certainly not sustainable? Or do we look at these later withdrawals of 2 to 3% that are very sustainable? So that can be a little tricky, which is why step 2 of running your retirement stress test to see can you retire is looking at what we'll call a straight line projection. What a straight line projection does is it says, assuming those withdrawal rates we just looked at, because the reality is most people don't just take 4% and increase that forever. Most people's withdrawals are staggered because of various expenses happening along the way, or because income sources change along the way. So it's not as simple as theory makes it out to be if you read a white paper about the 4% rule or the guardrails approach. It's a great place to start, but what's the implication of taking these various withdrawals that we just projected out over the course of their retirement? Well, if we assume a 6.5% growth rate for John and for Jane here, what this would look like is they would significantly start to draw down their portfolio for the first 10 years or so. This makes sense when we look at those withdrawals. They're taking out more from their portfolio than the portfolio is growing by at an average rate of return. So much so that their portfolio is cut in about half 10 years into retirement. Now what happens here is they stop taking out as much from their portfolio because their spending goes down and because their income goes up, and their portfolio actually starts growing from here on out. So this is why it's important to, yes, look at the withdrawal rates, but to compare that to step 2, what does a straight line projection look like? Because based upon the straight line projection, they're actually projected to be okay. Now I want to qualify what I mean by be okay. By be okay, I mean they have money left over at the end. What I don't mean by be okay is have a lot of financial security or have that peace of mind throughout this. I'd be the first to tell them, John and Jane, it's not going to be very comfortable going from 1.5 million down to about $850,000 10 years into retirement. How are you going to feel knowing that you're going to cut your portfolio in half in that first decade of retirement? How are you going to feel if you don't get 6.5% every single year, because you absolutely won't, if there's a 2008 market environment somewhere in between here? So let's not just look at this graph as if there's not an emotional component to financial planning as well. Let's try to imagine ourselves in this situation of our portfolio drawing down as craziness is happening in the markets, like it always will. Is this actually a scenario that you're okay with? You're probably fine here on out if you can make it through those first 10 years. But one of the things that we don't know is how would a 2008 market environment impact this? How would a prolonged downturn in your portfolio impact this? That's where we go to step 3 of your stress test, of the test that you want to do to understand can you actually retire, and that's called a probability of success or a Monte Carlo analysis. What a Monte Carlo analysis does is it says, John and Jane, based upon the types of assets you have in your portfolio, we don't know if you're going to retire and have wonderful markets or horrible markets or anything in between. But what we can do is we can run 10,000 different simulations of good, bad, ugly, everything in between, and say what percentage of the time would this mix of assets, based upon their return profile, standard deviation profile, what percentage of the time would you be okay here? Now, this aspect of the test, there's actually 2 parts to it. Number 1, you see right here, 67% probability of success. That's part 1. What are the odds of you being successful here? Now, this doesn't instill a tremendous amount of confidence in a lot of people, saying you got a 67% chance of success. The way you're probably interpreting that is you got a 33% chance of failure. And failure in most people's mind means I'm out on the street and I don't have a place to live, I don't have food, I don't have any of that. That's not exactly what this means. It means there's a 33% chance that if you do nothing the entirety of your retirement, you're not going to make it. You're going to run out of money before you run out of life. However, that's where good planning comes into play. What this really means is there's a good chance I'm gonna have to tell you, John and Jane, can we take this trip next year instead of this year? Hey, your portfolio's down. Can we cut back in any specific area? Are there other things we can do to mitigate some of the impact of those things that are out of our control, such as market returns? The second part to the Monte Carlo analysis. So if part 1 is understanding the probability of success, part 2 is understanding the severity of failure. Now, what do I mean by the severity of failure? What I mean is failure isn't created equal for everyone. For example, let's assume you want to live on $6,000 per month in retirement, and you've got a pension of $5,800 per month. What's the worst case scenario if you run out of your 401k money in that instance? You run out of money, but you still have $5,800 per month coming in. You're probably still living comfortably enough. Maybe you're making a little bit of a cut, but that failure isn't all that severe, even if you do run out of money. Versus, what if you want to live on $6,000 per month and all you have is $2,000 per month coming in Social Security? Well, the severity of failure there is pretty high. If you run out of money, say all your money's in your 401k and you spend that down, you're taking a significant pay cut. You're going from $6,000 per month to $2,000 per month. That is not an acceptable outcome. So we want to go deeper than just looking at what's the probability of success. We want to know in that situation or in that instance of failure, is that an acceptable outcome? Because believe it or not, for some people it is. For some people, it's, well, I got a pension, I've got Social Security, I've got rental income, the portfolio is kind of extra. I'm okay spending more freely, spending more upfront, enjoying more upfront, because even worst case scenario, if I run out of that, I still have strong income sources to meet my needs going forward. So that was a conversation I then had with John and Jane. I said, look, the good thing that you're doing in your plan is John's waiting until age 70 to collect Social Security. What that means is if one of you predeceases the other, you're going to have a high survivor benefit for the surviving spouse. That high survivor benefit, when we ran the numbers, it's enough to cover your basic living expenses. You're not traveling a whole bunch. You're not doing a whole bunch more on top of it, but it's enough to meet your core basic living expenses. So when we walked through that, it gave them a little bit more comfort. And by the way, this wasn't the plan that we actually recommended. If I skipped to the end a little bit, they said, you know what, we'd feel comfortable working another year or two. Because as you start looking at the impact of that, if they work another couple years, all of a sudden, it doesn't seem like a whole lot. What could 2 more years possibly do? But what it did is it took their probability of success from 67% to 93%. And when you run the comparison, you can see it put a whole lot more projected money in their pocket at the end of the day. This made them feel more comfortable than retiring at 60, examining the probability of success, examining the severity of failure. We walked through different options for them. That being said though, the general principles here are go through these steps as you're looking at your retirement plan. Number 1, what's the withdrawal rate test? How much are you projected to take out of your portfolio as a percentage of your assets? Number 2, look at the straight line projection. Based upon those withdrawal rates and based upon an assumed growth rate, what does your portfolio projection look like over the course of your retirement? And then number 3, run the Monte Carlo analysis. And remember, there's 2 components to that. What's your probability of success? And then what's the severity of failure? Now, that being said, that's not to say that that's the only thing that you need to stress test in your plan. That's absolutely the core. Those are the 3 steps that everyone should do, but there's other things here. This is the second thing that we looked at for John and Jane. We said, how would your plan be impacted if Social Security was reduced by 20%, or if inflation was higher by 1%, or if asset returns were lower by 1%? So what we need to start to see is risk is all these things. Risk can't just be summed up in a Monte Carlo analysis. It can't just be summed up by what the market does. What about healthcare costs? What about Social Security? What about you living longer? What about long-term care costs being higher than we anticipated? The reality is we need to start with the foundation, do that 3-step test to understand, are you in a good position to retire? But then when we looked at this for John and Jane, we could see, how does any of these things happening, Social Security being reduced, taxes being higher, healthcare being higher, we can see how does that impact your probability of success. What we could see, for example, Social Security being cut, that's going to have a pretty dramatic impact on your probability of success. That's why they weren't comfortable saying, yeah, let's just go ahead and retire at 60 because we've got a strong survivor benefit. We'll be okay. Unless Social Security gets cut, something that's out of our control. So these are the types of things that we want to plan for. Now, on top of all this, there's other factors we want to consider. What if there's an inheritance down the road? What if you sell your home and you downsize and you free up some equity? What if you just sell your home in worst case scenario? Are there any other windfalls? So we need to look at the things that can impact your plan in a negative way. We also have to consider those things that could potentially impact your plan in a positive way. Because the bottom line is, as you start to go through this, nobody wants to retire and have that feeling inside them that I don't really know if we're going to be okay or not. By going through this work up front, what it does is it sets you free. It frees your mind to enjoy your retirement because you know in advance what the impact of a bad market or Social Security being cut or taxes being higher or any of these various things, you know what the impact will be. You know you have a plan in place, and then you're truly free to enjoy your retirement. So now that you know what it looks like to stress test your retirement plan to see, can I actually retire? The next step is to understand, when should you actually retire? I've seen so many people spend so much time stress testing their plan, and when we finally show them, yes, you're good, then the emotional part, the mental part kicks in of, how do I actually retire? What am I actually gonna do? That's why I created this other video here. It's 5 reasons you should retire right now. Because I see so many people who get their finances right. They're in a good position to retire, but they just can't bring themselves to do it. There's a lot of risk to that people don't often understand. That's what I show in that video above. Once again, I'm James Knoll, founder of Root Financial, and if you're interested in seeing how we help our clients at Root Financial get the most out of life with their money, be sure to visit us at www.rootfinancialpartners.com.